Hello everyone. In this video we're going to be looking at grid items and the box model. So let's get to it. Okay, so in this video what I want to do is focus on the effect setting certain box model properties on an item would have on not only the item itself but the grid that it's inside of. Okay, so we're going to look at some sizing ones around the width of items, then the height of items, and then we'll get down to a situation where we're looking at padding and margins, okay, and see how they all affect items as well as the container. Cool. So for this first example, say that we have, in this case, a column that's 300 pixels wide, okay? So at the moment, we have that item sitting there at 300 pixels because it's stretching to fit the column. Now, the column definition here is grid auto columns of 300. Okay, so that's where the 300 comes from. What if I want to make this smaller? What if I want to set the width on this to say be 100 pixels? We save this, and now we can see that the item is in fact a little bit smaller. Now, it does say 144 here, but that's because I'm not using box sizing of border box. But the important thing to understand here is the item is 100 pixels supposedly wide, but the column is still 300 pixels wide. So that means that if we were to add another item, it would start literally here, not directly next to item 1. Okay, that's the important distinction. So that is when we change the width. That's the impact it has. But what if we change the min width and say make it really large, like 600 pixels? Well, what happens is the item grows to be that minimum size of 600 pixels. So it basically goes outside the bounds of the column. So we have an overflow problem here. Now, unfortunately, at the moment in CSS Grid, we don't have the capabilities of saying, okay, if you're overflowing a column, we want you to hide the content. We just have to live with at the moment that the item is going to span outside that column. So unfortunate there, but that's how it works right now. Cool. So that's what happens when we set a minimum width that's bigger than the width of the column. Now, if we set a max width to something a little bit smaller than the column, well, that will be pretty similar to what we did when we set the width. So if I go max width, we say 80%, and this time I might set a box sizing of border box, just like so, and save. Now, if the width of the column is 300 pixels wide, well, the width of the item should be 240, and it is, because 240 over 300 is basically 80%. Okay, so that's why it's 240. If I change this to, say, 200, right, 80% of 200 is 160. So if I check this now, we can still see it's 160. And there, the column, though, is 200 pixels wide. All right? So that's how a width of an item affects the item and the grid. Cool. Now, the last one, we can look at how padding affects it. So we can come in here and say padding left, and we might go 175 pixels, and then padding right, and we'll set it to the same amount, and save, and we can see that the item grew again to go outside the bounds of the column. So it doesn't actually reduce the padding either. So normally what happens with a block level element is if the child has a lot of padding and can't fit inside the boundaries of the parent, it will actually take away some of that padding to try and keep it within bounds. That's not the case here with columns, right? The column just says, okay, if you're too big for me, you're just going to overflow outside me, and that's all there is to it. Cool. So that's the impact of using padding on an item in a horizontal direction. It's still going to go outside the column. Now, what about if we use heights and rows? Okay, so in this situation, we have a grid that's one row high, and the height of the row is 300 pixels in each of these circumstances. Cool. So if I come down to the selector For the first one, we may want to set a height on this to say be, I don't know, probably 100 pixels as well, like so. And as you can see here, the item is in fact 100 pixels high, but the row stays at 300 pixels high. No big deal there. Pretty expected considering what we saw before. Same with a min height. If we set that to say this time 400 pixels, which is still bigger than 300, and save, well, you can see that this row here got a little bit bigger. And if I hover over the item, it's a little bit bigger than 400 in height, but you can see that it's overlapped the row, which is still being restricted to 300 pixels. All right, so same as what we saw with width, we see the same thing with height. So you can probably guess if we use a max height of something a little bit smaller, say 200 pixels, well, there it is. It's smaller than the height of the actual row, okay? No big deal there. And then again, if we use padding, so this time we'll go padding top of 175 pixels and padding bottom of 175 pixels as well. Save. Well, it gets bigger again and goes outside the bounds of the row, which is set to 300. And you can see here, this is now currently 354. Cool. No major deal there. Now, what about margins? So say we have an individual item in a cell here, say item 5. If I come down to that and say, all right, I'm going to apply a margin all the way around of 10 pixels and save. Well, what we get is that this item shrinks a little bit. The cell doesn't grow to cater for the margin. The item shrinks. So the idea is that the item will continue to shrink. So if I increase this to 40 pixels, it'll continue to shrink the item instead of increasing the size of the row or column track. Now, this is only the case when we set a template columns or rows, or we set an actual size for things, i.e. the size of the track is not auto or max content or something of that nature. It's actually a fixed size like 100 pixels or whatever, right? It has to be a fixed size for this to be the case. If I now go and say, you know, I'm going to change this to auto, just like so, then you can see that the height of the row did increase and so did the width, okay? So that's the important distinction there. If you're using auto, then it will increase, otherwise it won't. It'll reduce, and it'll reduce the size of the item to try and cater for that margin. Cool. So I'm going to reduce this back to 10. Now that's for an item in an individual cell. How does it behave if we have an item that, say, spans multiple columns? So in this case, maybe we want to set the margin to, let's say, 15 pixels and save. Well, it behaves the same way. Okay, so it sacrifices the size of the item to keep the margin within the bounds of the cells that it's spanning. Cool. So if I make this a little bit bigger, say 150, well, it disappears basically because it's too big. Let's go a little bit smaller than that. Let's go 30. And we can see now it's starting to chop into that item a lot to cater for that margin. I'll set that back to 15, like so, and leave it there. And then obviously, if we're spanning multiple rows, then we're going to have the same situation. So if I go margin, and we'll set this one to say, I don't know, let's go with 20 pixels. Then once again, item 3 shrinks a little bit to cater for that extra margin. All right, I don't have to mention any further about going, if we go 40, then it's going to shrink even more, so on and so forth, because we know pretty much by now that's how it works. Cool. Now, the last thing I just want to quickly cover here, or the last two things I should say, is what happens when we apply margins to maybe the bottom of one item in one cell and to the top of another item in another cell. So this here, this what appears to be a grid is actually just a regular div, all right? So if you don't know what margin collapse looks like, let's do the following, okay? So let's get the first item, and we're going to set a margin bottom on this, and we'll set it to, let's say, 20 pixels, all right? So if I do this right now, we get a space here in between the two items of 20 pixels. And that makes sense because we added a margin bottom of 20 pixels here. However, if I come to the last item, which is this item 2 here, and say margin top, and set that to 20 pixels as well, and save, well, what we get is that the space between these two items are still 20 pixels. Okay, so why is that? Well, that's just how browsers work. It's called margin collapse, right? So they take the best of the two differences, and that's how big it is. So if I was to change this to, say, 30, then the gap would grow just a little bit more to 30 pixels, because 30 is bigger than 20, all right? So I'll put that back to 20 and save. However, if we're using a grid, like this one down here, which is actually a grid, if I now come and say we're going to do the same thing, so margin bottom 20 pixels for the first item in the grid, and then margin top of 20 pixels for the second item in the grid. If we save this, then we get double the amount of space. So the important thing to understand here is that the cell defines the boundary of where the margin is affected. So we don't have margin collapse in this situation. Okay, that's the important thing to understand here. As soon as an item is in a cell, the bounds of the cell is where the margin is applied. Whereas in this situation, we have two elements right next to each other. So the golden rule is if they're right next to each other, we'll perform margin collapse because they're within the same parent. But in this case, item 1 and 2 are in what looks to be two different parents. Or at least that's how it behaves. Okay? So just understand that when you're adding margins to items that are in two different cells, it will add up the total overall margin between the two rather than collapsing it. Now, for the very last item, say, we would normally do a centering of an item in the past using margin of 0 auto like that. That's how we used to center items before we add Flexbox and CSS Grid. Well, if we do this on an item, this still works. Okay, so the item will no longer stretch. It will shrink down to its minimum size and center itself into the middle. But again, wouldn't recommend doing this. Just use the properties in CSS Grid or Flexbox, depending on what you're choosing. Okay? And that's all I wanted to cover in this video. So I'll see you all in the next one.